The motor theory of speech perception arises in the Haskins Laboratories, which is this very special research lab in Connecticut, in New Haven, that's kind of loosely associated with Yale University, but not a part of the university. And the people who started this lab in the 1950s were the first acoustic phoneticians. Well, mostly. There were ways of studying acoustics before the 1940s, but they were extremely labor and time intensive and involved sort of ridiculous contraptions that you'd have to use to try to record a sound before the advent of personal electronics. So there is research into acoustics going on in the 19th century, but really the beginning of the modern field of acoustic phonetics and speech perception happens after World War II. Now, during World War II, there's an American linguist named Joos, Carl Joos. I don't remember his first name, but his last name is Joos, Joos. And he is stationed on a submarine in World War II. And on this submarine, they have a highly classified secret piece of machinery, which is a spectrograph machine. It's a machine that can listen and find energy components at different frequencies. And on a submarine, this is going to be quite useful for detecting objects underwater around the submarine. But Joos, being a linguist, realizes that this is also going to be quite useful for looking at people's speech from an acoustic perspective. Right? So the first mechanized spectrograph machine is developed for use during World War II, and it's top secret and classified until the war is over. And then Joos comes back home, and in 1947, he writes a special supplement to the journal Language, which is the journal of the Linguistic Society of America, in which he announces the existence of an acoustic spectrograph machine and shows how you can use it to measure speech sounds and what some basic speech sounds look like. So just like that, overnight, all of a sudden there's a new field of acoustic phonetics. And this progresses into research that's going on. Most of the groundbreaking research here happens at Haskins Labs, although there are some other research centers in Europe and North America that are also making advances in acoustic phonetics in the 1950s and 60s. And the motor theory is sort of the next generation of Haskins Labs people in the 1960s and 70s coming up with a grand theory to try to explain all of these mysteries that they've discovered in the first 25 or 30 years of acoustic phonetics. Here's what the theory looks like. First of all, the basic unit of motor theory is not a feature like plus or minus voice, or a segment like pa or ta or a. The basic unit of language, right, of phonology, of phonetics in this theory is that, and the objects of speech perception, is the intended phonetic gesture of the speaker. Here's what they say about these. The first claim of the motor theory as revised, and this 1985 paper, I guess, is a slightly different version of the motor theory from earlier versions, is that the objects of speech perception are the intended phonetic gestures of the speaker, represented in the brain as invariant motor commands that call for movements of the articulators through certain linguistically significant configurations. These gestural commands are the physical reality underlying the traditional phonetic notions. For example, tongue backing, lip rounding, and jaw raising that provide the basis for phonetic categories. They are the elementary events of speech production and perception. So here are some key points about this notion. The intended phonetic gesture, according to this statement, resides in the brain, right? Not in the vocal tract. And that's the first important thing to understand about intended phonetic gestures. They are not actually gestures. they're not physical movements of articulators. Instead, they are some representation of those movements that resides in the brain, or maybe more directly relevant to what we're doing, in the mind, which we assume is caused by the brain, right? So these are not actual gestures. They're more like goals for gestures. In fact, I think maybe naming them gestures was a mistake because it's kind of confusing. If you just named them phonetic goals or gestural goals or something like that, to me that would be a more truthful statement of what the concept's about. So here they call them commands, right? Like my representation of this speech sound is going to send some instructions to my articulators. I would equally well call that a goal or a command for movements, not the movements themselves. So these are abstract representations. They're not something that you can just reach out and measure the way that you can measure the position of the tongue tip. Instead, these are going to be abstractions that are representations in the mind of how you would like to move your articulators, or where you would like to move them to, or something like that. So they refer to them as commands that call for movements. Whether or not those movements are actually achieved is going to depend on a number of things, but the commands themselves are going to stay constant. Here's their statement of this. We have to say intended gestures because for a number of reasons, co-articulation being the most obvious, the gestures are not directly manifested in the acoustic signal or in the observable articulatory movements. All right? If you go back to this X-ray tracing, we've already seen this in the acoustic signal, but even in this X-ray tracing, it's not like, oh, here's where one movement ends and the next movement begins. Things aren't neatly separated like that in here. Instead, these are actual physical movements, and we're going to need to posit a number of abstract cognitive representations that generated these movements, where presumably our mental representations for a pa and a pa are going to be the same, but they're going to combine with other gestural goals to create different physical realizations of these different kinds of intended phonetic gestures. It's thus no simple matter to define specific gestures rigorously or to relate them to their observable consequences, yet clearly invariant gestures of some description there must be, for they are required not merely for our particular theory of speech perception, but for any adequate theory of speech production. Why is that? Well, presumably, if we think that the pa in peace and the pa in plot is represented at some level as being the same in linguistic grammar, and we do. These are both voiceless bilabial stops. They're both the same phoneme. Then there must be some level of representation at which they're the same when we're speaking them. The fact that they come out slightly physically different every time we say them or in every different context, that's going to be a matter of gestural blending and co-articulation, but underlying that complex physical reality, again at a level of abstraction, just like we think the feature plus labial is plus labial every time it occurs, we want the motor goal or the intended phonetic gesture for that segment or for the features inside it to also be at some abstract underlying level the same every time it happens. And so the claim of motor theory is that what corresponds to invariant categorical abstract linguistic features, which we know we need in order to get the fact that languages have a grammar and are phonological and store things in terms of phonemic categories, the claim of motor theory is that the basic abstract invariant unit over which those representations operate in the lexicon and in phonological computations is this intended phonetic gesture. Okay, I'm going to break out here for one last video.